of the air. Passengers on the Brabazon were to travel in style. They would have their own bunks in private cabins, powder rooms, a cocktail bar, even a separate cinema. Brabazon would offer space and luxury, just like the great transatlantic liners. Which was another reason for the size of the plane, so unbelievably huge that the public's understanding of it had to be helped along by comparing Brabazon with the Statue of Liberty or Nelson's Column. Before BAC began creating a Brabazon that would fly, they made a mock-up out of wood and paper. It was built to the same scale as the real thing, and craftsmen at Filton, who were accustomed to crawling through the cramped fuselages of ordinary planes, were startled at the first sight of these massive dimensions. The Brabazon seemed cavernous, colossal. To be chosen for the project was considered a privilege. One man who worked on it as an apprentice is Councillor Bob Wall, now Sir Robert Wall.
It's a great leap forward. Now, there was only one company, really, who could do that, and that was this Bristol company with its structural techniques. And it was built more like a ship, really, than an aeroplane. The first machine was built over in number 2 flight shed, not here in the hangar. Very tight fit. In fact, it was a tremendous operation actually getting it out of that hangar. And it was built really with a series of jigs, a bit like on the stocks of a shipyard, built from the bottom cradle up, and then the big frames put in. Of course, all this was worked out on a wooden mock-up.
What often isn't appreciated is that it not only was a fine-looking aeroplane, and it sounds strange to talk about this white elephant as being a great achievement, but it was. It was such a difficult design to fly non-stop across the North Atlantic westbound that every ounce had to be saved that could possibly be saved.
Draftsmen, studying the shell of a bird's egg, had discovered that strength may lie in shape, not in girders.
For the first time ever, not only in Britain but in any country, even the skin panels that cover the wings and the fuselage, they were measured all over. They weren't standard stock. They were specially arranged so that the thicknesses were just right for the job. The engines were, of course, the engines that were needed for the job. The first Brabazon had piston engines because that was the only way that you could fly the Atlantic. Gas turbines, either jets or propeller turbines, burnt far too much fuel in those early days. They were inefficient from the fuel point of view, so you had to have piston engines, and you just simply needed a certain amount of power, and the power that you needed was 20,000 horsepower. That's 8 engines of 2,500 horsepower each. And the only way that you could do it was to have 4 pairs of coupled engines. These themselves were a very major engineering achievement. You had 2 huge engines and a giant gearbox, out of which came a long propeller shaft, 2 propeller shafts, one inside the other, turning these enormous propellers.
Near the Brabazon, they were building an assembly hall so huge that it could have taken both the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth side by side. When it became time to shift Brabazon out of the old flight shed and into the new hangar, she was already so big there were just inches to spare. So they called it Operation Shoehorn.
At Bristol, we get a first glimpse of the Brabazon transport plane. The 126-ton airliner is transferred for completion to a newly built hangar. More than £4 million worth of material has gone into giving Britain the world's biggest aeroplane. The 143-foot-long passenger compartment can seat 100 people who will fly the Atlantic in 12 hours.
Bill Pegg, Bristol's chief test pilot, was going to have to fly a machine that was radically different from any other. So, to help him familiarize himself, all its internal workings were laid out on the hangar floor and were operated to simulate flight. The hydraulic systems in particular were assembled and tested to give Peg a feel of how this massive, complex plane would perform.
It wasn't like this. First of all, the flight deck was much bigger. In fact, you could have held a dance on it compared to this. And while there were as many instruments, most of them were back on the flight engineer's panel. And in those days, we had two flight engineers, one for the engine equipment and one for the aircraft equipment. There were a lot of new things on it, and of course, the first thing was the size. It was enormous compared to other things we'd flown. I'd flown Lancasters and Lincolns, which were about 30 tons, and here we are going to an aeroplane 150 or 170 tons. It was the first modern